Good evening, students. I'm very glad to be here. Today we are going to talk on second language acquisition, and this is part of CTE and a little bit more than CTE. But since we've covered so many topics in CTE, I just feel that we need to just go a little beyond, so that as teachers you can be really effective teachers. So we begin from the earlier 20th century. What was happening then? What were the teaching traditions then, the ELT traditions then? Well, as we all know, and I've talked about it on several other occasions, it was behaviorism in psychology and structuralism in linguistics, right? And the buzzwords were that the mind of the child is a clean slate. So one of the buzzwords was clean slate. If you gave a certain stimulus to the students, they would get a certain response. We would get a certain response. There was learning was really habit formation. So you learned the language by learning good habits, and these habits had to be from time to time reinforced. So the keywords were clean slate, stimulus response, habit formation, reinforcement. And in terms of, this is behaviorism in psychology. Now structuralism in linguistics, which was tremendously affected by behaviorism in psychology, the language was looked at a surface level. It was dissected and parsed. We had this famous parsing of language into discrete units, and basically that was what was happening in terms of linguistic analysis. And the analysis was dividing it into, literally parsing it into various parts of speech. Then what was happening in language teaching? Because linguistics and psychology affects linguistics, linguistics affects language teaching, and that's the trend all the time. It was the audio-lingual approach and programmed instruction. That was the name of the game. Now, what is the audio-lingual approach, and why was it, in a sense, the most important thing happening? As you remember, the war was also on during the height of the behaviorist period. The World War was on, and soldiers had to be quickly and effectively able to speak. So they were, the way to teach them the various foreign languages was by oral patterned practice. They thought that was the quickest way. So this audiolingual approach was basically all about oral patterned practice, and that is what was happening. Now, another key term of this era was contrastive analysis. And before I talk about contrastive analysis, I want to tell you a little bit about the way errors were looked at by the structuralists. Errors were, had to be totally eradicated. They were like the worst sins anybody committed in language learning and teaching, and teachers were paranoid about errors, and because errors led to bad habits, and habits, language teaching was all about habit formation. So you could not risk a child learning bad habits. And so how did you sort of decide that this is going to lead to error? You needed a tool of prediction, and this tool of prediction was what we called contrastive analysis. So what you looked at was, you looked at the structure of the L1, that is the and the structure of L2. L1 is the mother tongue of the students, and L2 is the target language. And you saw the points of similarities, and you saw the points of differences. Now, where there were points of similarities, that was no problem, because you felt that the student will just pick up, will transfer learning from L1 to L2. The difficulty arose when there was this question of where there were differences. between L1 and L2, and the teachers had to be very careful that wherever there were differences, they had to really enforce those aspects of language, and that was known as contrastive analysis. This whole business of looking at L1 and L2 and predicting predicting where the L1 and L2 are similar and where they are different. Now, language teaching also affects testing, obviously. So you see this very nice kind of flow chart between, a very neat flow chart actually, between psychology, linguistics, language teaching, and now language testing. So testing also, since it was the language was sort of looked at in terms of discrete items, so the testing was also in terms of discrete point tasks. So you'd have a lot of fill in the blanks. You know, the fill in the blanks that we still have, they're all from the structuralist period. There were these multiple choice, substitution tables, matching exercises. So these were the testing tools that were developed at that point of time. And these had to be very carefully statistically worked out, because it was all about good numbers and good habits and good statistics. Obviously, you yourself can see that there are lots of problems with such a theory. And we have Chomsky, who comes along with and he questions the structuralist behaviorist theory. And he says that a child is much more. There is so much more in a child's language than what he or she has picked up by just habits or just the input, the stimulus that he or she has got. Because the child is coming up with so much language, and where has he or she heard this language? So evidently there is more to just a child being a clean slate, and that's what we need to look at. And he talks about the creativity of the child's language, that the human child is able to produce such complex structures that he or she has never heard before. And where is that coming from? And the child is also mastering very complex and abstract linguistic rules, which were in a sense never taught to the child. So where is all this coming from? This is what Chomsky is positing. So then he says, he talks of this, he posits his own theory of a cognitive theory of language, and or the mentalist theory as it is also called. He talks of the creativity of the human mind, that the child and any human being creates or produces sentences that he or she has never heard before, never spoken before, and will perhaps never speak in the future. So that's how creative the human language is, the human mind is. And he said that the child is innately endowed with a language acquisition device, which he calls the LAD, which is popularly known, not he calls the LAD, it's popularly known as LAD, the language acquisition device. It's innate. And to corroborate what he's saying, he says that there is a striking uniformity in the way children of different linguistic backgrounds acquire comparable grammar of great complexity. So a child sitting in Singapore, a child sitting in in Russia, a child sitting in America, the child sitting in China, they will produce such, go through certain stages, whatever language they belong to, and they will, with equal complexity, be able to, in a very short while, produce sentences. So evidently the child is innately endowed with a language acquisition device and a universal grammar. And so this is what Chomsky talked about. So you see there's a paradigm shift. So it is not a question of just tinkering with what the structuralists are saying. It is an absolute paradigm shift. And then you would ask, but did it have a direct impact on language learning? it did not have a direct impact, but it certainly had an indirect impact on language learning. Now, what was this indirect impact of Chomsky? So let's talk a little bit about that. One of the major points that emerged was that what is known as the identity hypothesis. And there was a whole lot of studies, and if you read Vivian Cook's book on first language acquisition and second language acquisition, this whole business of that second language acquisition actually parallels first language acquisition, and this was part of what is known as the identity hypothesis. And again, to sort of go along with this kind of thinking, you had what is known as the morpheme acquisition studies. And these studies showed that there was an invariant order of acquisitions in the morphemes of first and second language acquisition. That means that the child acquired certain set of morphemes. Certain morphemes are just, let's say, things like articles, auxiliaries, structure words in other sense. That the child acquired the same pattern of morphemes in the first language as they would acquire in the second language, and there was a whole lot of short-term studies and longitudinal studies which tried to prove that there was a parallel between first and second language acquisition, and there was this invariant order. And like all theories, everything can be falsified. Any good theory can be falsified, but this was actually not such a good theory. It was criticized on both theoretical and method. Okay. There was a lack of comparability of the order of morphemes in both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. That was first. After the first, honeymoon period was over, this was discovered. Earlier it is that you found this exciting theory of first language acquisition exactly like, second language acquisition exactly like first language acquisition. Look at these morphemes. They have these invariant order, whether it's first or second language acquisition. But that period, the euphoria soon got over, and it was found that there was a lack of comparability between the morphemes in the first and the second language in both the cross-sectional as well as the longitudinal studies. And then also the validity of the choice of morphemes was questioned. Why do we need to choose these morphemes and not some other morphemes? Is it because we're trying to prove a point? What is it all about? Then there was this whole, again, re-examination of the issue, and lots of differences between L1 and L2 were posited. People said now that, and research of course showed, of course something which is very obvious, that the L2 learners are often older than L1 learners, so they come with, they have better knowledge of the world, which they will put to use in their language acquisition, in their second language acquisition. They have a wider range of semantic concepts because they require it in their lives. They have a longer memory span than little children. They have a much more developed cognitive system. Their social interactions are so much more varied, so they need the language, they need L2 for very different purposes than a child would need an L1. So obviously there's a difference between L1 and L2. The motivation and attitude to learn is also very different in where L1 and L2 speakers are concerned, and the exposure to L2 is much more limited in most cases. So these were some of the differences that were suggested, which made it quite clear that there has to be necessarily a difference between L1 and L2 acquisition. So again, I'll just repeat these, that learners were older, they were supposed to have better knowledge of the world, they were supposed to have wider semantic concepts, they longer memory span, more developed cognitive system, social interactions there, because they were older, were more varied. Because it is a second language, unlike a first language, the motivation and attitudes are very different, and exposure to the L2 is necessarily much more limited, because there's an L1 which you will often use in circumstances. Then we come to what is known as error analysis. We talked about error, so let's look at how errors were looked at both by the behaviorists I've already talked about. Now, how did the Chomskyan paradigm look at errors? And it became a very major discipline, this whole discipline of error analysis, and you will find it in CT Block 3, Course 1, right? There's a whole, I think, two chapters on error analysis. And as you all know, it was established by Pitcorder and his colleagues. And it was literally an alternative to contrastive analysis, which is unable to predict a great majority of errors. So they tried contrastive analysis and they found that they are unable to predict a lot of errors. So they say that, why is that? Why is it that we are unable to predict? We are comparing the two languages. We've seen the points of similarities and differences. Now there should be no problem. But they found that the students did so many things. They overgeneralized rules. They made faulty inferences. And of course they transferred from L1. That was obviously there. But there were other things that need factoring in. And so that was another issue. And there was also, because a whole shift in attitude towards false errors of second language learners, from bad habits that had to be just immediately eradicated and just dispelled with as sins literally. There was a whole shift in error analysis. And point one was that language learning implies making assumptions about the nature of language, its phonology, morphology, syntax and semantics. Okay, so the learner is making assumptions. First thing is this: the learner makes assumptions about this L2 in terms of the phonological structure, the morphological structure, the syntax, the semantics of it. Now, based on these assumptions, the learner formulates hypotheses about the structure of language they're learning. Okay. So each time they use the language in speech or writing, they're in a matter of fact testing the hypothesis. That's what's happening. They've made the hypothesis, they've made the assumptions. Now they use real data to, whenever they speak or write, to test out the hypothesis. Is it working or is it not working? The same as when we do our research. Now, the learner's incorrect hypothesis, because when you hypothesize, and especially learners, they can make incorrect hypotheses, or become errors, of course. And these so-called errors give the teacher very valuable clues about the assumptions they're making about the structure of language that they're learning. So this way, the teacher gets to know what are the assumptions that these kids are making about, these people are making about the L2. And so these errors assume enormous significance for the language teacher, but not significance in order to eradicate them, but because to indicate what the learner is thinking. Is he overgeneralizing? Is he making a faulty assumption? Is he transferring? And so the teacher's job is not to correct the surface error, but actually to gear his or her teaching to correct the wrong assumption, to teach the right rule, in other words. So they can move closer to the structure and system of the language that they are learning. Now see the difference. In the behaviorist and structuralist mode, what would they do? They'll give you a whole lot of substitution tables and practice exercises where you will substitute and you will fill in the blanks and you will try and correct the errors in that fashion. But as teachers who are in this communicative or in this kind of paradigm, the Chomskyan paradigm, the cognitive paradigm, the teacher is going to attack the rules, is going to try and set right the rules for the learner, not just give practice. Now, of course, to talk about further about the errors, there was this whole notion of interlanguage, and and there was a lot of instead of saying, oh, this is such faulty learning that is happening, the learner's language was seen in its own terms as a natural language with a consistent set of rules. So it was the stage at which a learner had learned their L2 was like seen in its own term. And it was also discovered that the learner does not make scattered, ad hoc, isolated mistakes, but they're making systematic mistakes. And the learner's system is also evolving and developing as as there's better input, as there is more input, as there's more language, as there is more learning, there's more teaching that is happening, the learner system is seen as evolving or developing. And so you get a much more dynamic and positive view of the learner's learning strategies. That is what is being looked at now, is the learner's learning strategies. Then another offshoot of this whole Chomskyan shift in paradigm was the notion of communicative competence, which I'm going to talk about now. Now, Chomsky talks about competence and performance. Competence is the ideal grammar of the internal grammar of the individual, and performance are the mistakes the learner makes because of slips of tongue, because of memory lapses, because of other lack of attention. So he differentiates between competence, which is perfect, and performance, which is imperfect in a sense. And Delheims in 1971 says that grammatical competence is not a sufficient basis for communication. Okay? You have to have what is known as communicative competence. And communicative competence is basically that a speaker should know when to speak, when not, and what to talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner. I'll repeat. Communicative competence is where a speaker knows when to speak, when not, and as to what to talk about, with whom, when, where, and in what manner. And this led to communicative language teaching, where the job of the teacher was to train learners in interactive, interpretive, and expressive skills. So the job of the teacher is not to teach sentences which they are going to mug up and to imbibe and reproduce, but to train the learners in interactive skills, in interpretive skills, in expressive skills, and in strategies which are required for negotiating meaning. This is what a learner, the teacher's job, is to get the students ready for. So this led logically to what is known as communicative language teaching. Now let's look at some of the points of communicative language teaching. So from communicative competence, you get communicative language teaching. And here we talk of the role of the learner and the role of the teacher. The role of the learner becomes very different. No longer the clean slate who sits passively and has this teacher who's the repository of knowledge, give all this knowledge to him or her. The role of the learner becomes that of the active participant in the teaching process. And the role of the teacher is also more of that of a facilitator, a learner among learners. Okay? So there's such a shift. So it's not a repository of knowledge, but somebody who is learning with the learners, is a facilitator, is a manager of the learning process. Then there's also a change in the syllabus. So from a syllabus which is very structure oriented, the grammar syllabuses, you come to more communicative, where notions and functions become the name of the day. The instructional materials used are also different. So they won't be just activities which have lots of substitution, matching, fill in the blanks, but instructional materials are very close to what the learner's cultural and social and learning situation is. Becomes a different ball game. And the tasks and activities are not mechanical anymore. They are to provide opportunities for language use. Okay? So now there's a lot of emphasis on interaction, on expression, and that becomes the important thing. The atmosphere in the classroom also changes. From the teacher-fronted classroom, where the teacher sort of sits in front and or stands in front and is giving these lectures to the student, where the student very carefully and very seriously notes down every word that the teacher is saying, it becomes a much more communicative atmosphere in the classroom. There's pair work, there's group work, there's a lot of moving around of furniture, there's a lot of noise in the language classroom, and it's a very different scenario from our old days. And classroom management necessarily also becomes, in the English class at least, a very different affair. The atmosphere also is without anxiety, because language learning is not about examinations, it is about interpretation, it is about interaction, it is about communication. So the anxiety is to go out of the language classroom, and this impacted assessment as well, and we have the communicative tests and the integrative tests, which became the name of the game. So these are where communicative language teaching, in a sense, impacted on the whole curriculum. Now let's see the impact of CLT or communicative language teaching on the classroom. One is that communication had to happen within the classroom in natural and meaningful contexts. This is not to gainsay that the classroom itself is a very natural situation. So classroom itself is a situation, just like doctor and patient is a situation, and just like a conversation between strangers is also a interesting situation. And unlike the earlier approaches, there was integration of skills. That is, you did not so totally separate the writing skill and the reading skill and the speaking skill and the listening skills. There was a interaction of all these skills. There was also the use of authentic material in the classroom. So it was not only a matter of textbooks. It was a matter of the newspaper in the classroom, the magazines in the classroom, the storybooks in the classroom. That was another thing which is happening. And it was no longer the teacher standing up and delivering a lecture, but it was by the students actively participating and learning by doing. And as I mentioned earlier, classroom organization was pair work, group work, very individualized also, because now the CLT is also a humanistic approach. So each child is celebrated, and each different learning styles are looked deeply into. So the individual also becomes important, and of course this is not to say that there was never any teacher front classroom expected. It was expected, but and this is not what is known as whole class activities. These happened, but these were not the only option available to the teacher. Then there was focus on meaning from form. Earlier in the structuralist mode, there was a lot of emphasis on form. You had to get the form correct. Here the emphasis is on meaning. Now, in the structures, you had to eradicate errors. There was just focus on accuracy. Now language learning became confidence building. It became all about fluency, and accuracy followed. If there was confidence, if there was fluency, accuracy would follow. As I said, teacher was a facilitator, a manager, a learner among learners. Another aspect which was looked at was the skill of questioning. Okay, the teacher has to question. That is part of the this whole business of teaching, learning. But the student also had to be given his or her right time. So there was this wait time research that was done, that you could not ask a question and then expected pat answer. You had to give the student some time to think and come up with an answer. You know, this is this whole business of very individualized instruction. So skills of questioning were also looked at very carefully. Then the interaction, the language learning did not stop in the classroom. It extended much beyond the classroom. The focus was on using the language, and it was on the process of learning rather than on the product of learning. Then we go on to syllabus in the CLT classroom. Notional categories were important now. Communicative functions were important, like requests, suggestions, complaints. You know, these were other normal things that happen in life, and these were taught to the students so that they are able to communicate effectively. And in order to, you know, again, it is the learner is very important. So it is not, okay, I have decided that this is the syllabus and I create a syllabus. It was need-based analysis. Procedures were worked out, because all syllabus had to cater to the learners. It was not to cater to the teacher. And the approach was basically a task-based approach. So what was the learner all about? What were the learner factors that were researched and considered? One was age. That became a very important issue, because you had to take, in all the migrations that happened, there were older people, younger people, and they both had to be catered to. So age was a big factor. Gender was another factor which was looked at, and it was found that females were better language learners than males, and lots of reasons for that, which I have talked about earlier. Intelligence was looked at but didn't show too much. Aptitude was looked at. Aptitude in second language acquisition was looked at. Cognitive style and personality factors become very important in this business of learning in L2. Your attitude towards both your L1 and L2 is also important in learning in L2, and how much motivation you have. That is another issue that was looked at. Now there was some models, second language acquisition models, which were, you know, which was part of this whole business of acquisition. And the most famous was Krashen's monitor model. And this model tried to incorporate various social, psychological and cognitive factors involved in second language acquisition. And this was into a comprehensive theoretical framework, and on the basis of which he evolved the monitor theory. What he tried to do, and it has been criticized quite a bit, but let's just quickly go through what he tried to do. He distinguished between learning and acquisition, and he said that acquisition was more important by learning, and learning actually is only happens as a monitor. Learning is only as a monitor. Actually, all language has to be acquired, and learning is only a monitor, and it's constrained by factors such as time. So you can only monitor all the L2 that you've learned if you have time to monitor it, if you are looking at the form, and if you have knowledge of the rules. Otherwise you cannot monitor anything. And the best methods of teaching was to supply what is known as comprehensible input. That is, comprehensive input was just to go beyond what the learner can fully understand, just go a step beyond. So there is a bit of a challenge for the learner, and yet it is not so difficult that the learner cannot comprehend anything. There has to be low anxiety, because learner will only learn in low anxiety situation. And it should be messages what the student wants to hear. So it has to be stuff that the student wants to learn, is close to his interest, is close to his or her culture, is close to his context. So this is what Krashen's monitor model. And of course, everything is post these days. So the post-communicative era, there were certain trends which are changing. Now there is a little, you learn from your mistakes. So what is the learning that happened? One was, there is a realization that there has to be some amount of learning, which is actually what the structuralists insisted on, learning of structures. So this, especially where vocabulary is concerned, and it is now believed that you learn a lot of language is the lexical chunks that you learn, and the students who are fluent in the language use many more lexical phrases than students who are not so fluent in the language. And there was this rethinking on grammar. Grammar was not so popular in the communicative era, but now there is an emphasis on grammar. But of course, communicative grammar taught differently, and there's also a relook at syllabus design. So these are the major trends that are happening in the post-communicative era. And so what I have done today is I've looked at second language acquisition. I've gone through the whole gamut, from the behaviorist structuralists to the Chomskyan, to Delheims, to Delheims who talked of communicative competence, to communicative language teaching, to communicative language teaching in the classroom, and now into the post-communicative era. Now, if you do have any questions, I'd be very glad to answer them, and if you don't, then I shall wind up now. So, any questions, please? No. Okay. So, thank you very much. It was nice being here, and I hope next time there will be much more interaction. Thank you very much.